We're here today to talk with Sing Chu, a Humboldt State professor in the sociology department. And Sing has recently written a book called World Ecological Degradation and published a paper called Globalization and Ecological Downturn, The Coming of the Next Dark Age. Why I think it's so important to talk with Sing about his work at this point, even though it was written before the events of September 2001, I think it sheds some light on the world situation. Most people talking about it now are talking about it in terms of recent history. Sing has looked at world history on a long-term basis, on a 5,000-year basis, and he's talking about a relationship between culture and nature that also plays a dynamic part. We tend to look at most of the relationships as relationships between cultures, but he's talking about a relationship between dominant cultures and nature. Sing, can you tell me a little bit about your book and what led you to publish at this particular time?
Well, it has been a long-term project that started in the early 90s. And at that point in time, I was really interested in looking at the way natural resources are extracted over long-term periods. And in this case, I was very interested in looking in the timber and lumber operations on a global basis. As I proceeded into the project, I suddenly realized that the issue is much broader, and therefore I expanded the study to include other aspects of what now I term ecologically degradative behavior by different cultures over time. And one of the things that I was really particularly interested in looking at is the issue of whether over time have there been any changes in terms of cultural relationship with nature, and that if there are changes, what are they? And if there are no changes, why isn't there any change? And so those are the sort of themes that permeate the book. As I begin to look at the material, then it seemed very clear to me that there are certain what I call transhistorical themes that seem to transcend time and space, that in certain ways, how would I put it? In certain ways, it determine, I don't want to make it too deterministic, but in a certain way, condition, I would say, our relationship with nature. And in the book, as a subtitle of the book talks about, there are really three main transhistorical processes. The process of the accumulation of capital or the making of profits. The second trend would be the issue of urbanization, and urbanization has been a long-term historical process. And as one of the famous historians, Gordon Charles, says, it's the urban revolution that took human societies to a different phase following the Neolithic Revolution. And then the last, of course, is one issue that seems to be on the agenda in most global discussion on the future of the planet, is the issue of population. And the issue of population therefore becomes part of the theme in this book. And what I do is try to trace the trajectory of human population growth and to understand it within the dynamics of how culture relates to nature.
Many people that talk about economics now tend to talk as if a world economy is a rather new phenomenon, but you treat it as a very historical phenomenon. Can you talk about some of the cultures that have participated in a rather global economy in the 5,000 years that you're talking about?
Now that's a underlining theme of the book, because these days when we talked about the world economy, we talk about a globalized world, and it sort of seems to imply to a lot of people and even among academics that globalization is a stage that we have reached. And in this book, what I try to do is to try to show that globalization is a historical process, and as human civilizations begin to transform itself, the trade linkages and human social relations become more and more linked to each other over time and over historical space. And as the book attempts to do, I started first of all looking at the Fertile Crescent, which is the part of right now, a very important area which all of America is looking at is where the Middle East and where the early civilizations emerge. And the first chapter of the book tries to address and examine two civilizations, the civilization of southern Mesopotamia and the Indus civilization of northwestern India, or what is now Pakistan. And what I try to show in that chapter is the set of trade linkages between these two great civilizations of that period, around about 4,700 years ago, and how they interrelate with their immediate community and with other communities very far away in a set of interconnections. In that sense, what one would say is that there was then the emergence of a set of economic linkages and a set of globalizing processes that seem to bring more and more regions and areas of the world within a tighter and tighter net of economic and social cultural activities. What I was trying to show in the early chapters is the trade and cultural interconnections between some of these early civilizations, one located in southern Mesopotamia and one located in what is now in Pakistan, called the Indus civilization. What is really interesting about this analysis is that it provides us an opportunity to show how linked these two civilizations are with the rest of the surrounding communities, whereby these peripheral areas are supplying a lot of natural resources and a lot of grain to meet some of the needs of these communities and civilizations. And it's almost similar to what we are experiencing now, whereby peripheral areas supply core areas with the necessary natural resources, the energy supplies to reproduce core needs. In that sense, when you look at it, you're already beginning to see the emergence of a globalized world, though in this context it is the connection between the Gulf and a community or a civilization based in the Indian Ocean. And as you go through the book, it attempts to draw out for you all the various trade connections as the economic linkages expand outwards.
In the book, you talk about a reoccurring process of as the urbanization becomes more rapid, it eventually leads basically to the downfall of the culture and potentially to a new dark age. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, what is interesting is that I was looking for processes and perhaps even conditions which in certain ways takes a society out of its relationship with nature that is symbiotic to a situation whereby you see degradative relationships. And one of the clearest indicators of such a situation in the sense of a process is the process of urbanization. Because when you have urbanization, what you're trying to do is to, in a sense, transform the landscape to meet a set of needs. In this case, a growing population that is becoming denser and denser. And you have cities in southern Mesopotamia 4,700 years ago of 100,000 in size. So as they go into this urbanized trajectory, therefore increasingly they require more and more resources to reproduce the needs of that community in question. And therefore you tend to therefore see in the long run a beginning signs of a degradative relationship with the environment, which you don't really see with smaller communities or small decentralized situations. Therefore, what is important to realize, therefore, is that as we urbanize, we intensify our relationship with nature. What is also interesting is that we do tend to see cycles whereby you have extreme urbanization reaching a certain period where you have de-urbanization. And this is when you have what I call periods of dark ages. And in the book, I try to draw out certain phases whereby communities, once they push themselves to the ultimate limit, for all intents and purposes, a long historical period, then suffers what we call societal collapse. And we see cases of that in relationship with Mesopotamia and the Harappan civilization or the Indus civilization of northwestern India, whereby they push their ecological limits to the extreme, and therefore what they encounter is a failure in terms of the agriculture, in terms of production levels, as a consequence of salinization, as a consequence of deforestation, as a consequence of soil erosion on that basis. Then coupled with that, those series of conditions, you also have conditions of climatological changes occurring during certain periods. And when you have a system that's already stressed in terms of productive activity, when they are faced with climatological changes, then it further puts further stress on the system. And coupled with that, during that period of their collapse from 1750 BC onwards, you also have tectonic shifts which further divert water systems, and therefore cause even tremendous consequences in terms of flooding in areas that there are extreme high density of people, and therefore you have all these circumstances in a sense concatenating at a certain point in world history, and therefore you have what we call civilizational collapse. And then you go through a long period of what I call decreased economic and social activities. In the sense of economic activities, you have the break off in terms of trade linkages with other regions, and you have deurbanization, and in some cases loss of population or very slow population growth. These are periods of what I have termed dark ages, and some historians have also called them as dark age periods. And these are very interesting periods because these are periods that are completely different from the prior periods of extreme urbanization, high population growth, high economic activity, high cultural affluence, and then you go into this sort of dark age periods. And for a lot of social historians, these are chaotic times. These are times whereby if you use a growth mentality, these are really awful times to be living in. But from my position, it might be awful times for civilizations and communities to be in. But for nature, it's a period of restoration. And I believe, as you look through history, that these are periods where nature gets an opportunity to restore itself. And then when that restorative period continues and nature gets to restore itself, then you also see economic life returning, cultural affluence coming into being, and you have urbanization and so on and so forth. So therefore you have these long cycles of growth and ecological degradation, and long cycles of economic depression, stagnation, and cultural decimation. So what do we have? We have these cycles. And so it's important to realize these cycles. And this cycle seems to last between 600 to 1,000 years in length. And so if we can get a better understanding of these cycles, then we can better anticipate what we could possibly foresee for the future. And what can we tell from this? We have been looking at pollen analysis, not on a global basis because they are not available, but looking at certain regions in terms of long-term pollen counts, in terms of deforestation, to give us a better idea of how these cycles work. And what is really interesting is some of the pollen analysis that I have been able to find indicates that deforestation also occurs in phase with these cycles of expansion and contraction.
In talking about deforestation and climate change, throughout the book there are various phenomena that relate to that culture-nature balance, but probably deforestation is the primary changing factor. Could you talk about why deforestation is so important throughout history?
Well, yes. In the chapter 1 of the book, I have a section talking about the role of wood in human history. And the role of wood has always been a very important aspect of human history, mainly because wood has been used in various human activities, from shelter to help in our agricultural production in terms of implements, wood handles and so on and so forth, and also to our basic life necessities in terms of keeping warm. Right? So on this basis, wood has had a long history of meeting human needs, and therefore it is from my point of view, it is quite important for us to trace the history of the utilization of wood by human communities over time and space. And on that basis, wood can be a proxy for us to understand our relationship with nature. In other words, when we have extreme deforestation, that means that we have over degraded our land, and therefore you see certain consequences. And all these consequences have occurred through time, and they're quite common through time. You have soil erosion, you have flooding, right? And energy scarcity, when they were using wood as a basic source to heat their homes and also for their own cooking. The scarcity of wood has tremendous consequences for the reproduction of lifestyle. Wood was also very important in the early stages of human history, even as late as the late 17th century, in terms of as an energy source. And therefore you find throughout periods when there's wood scarcity, production locations have to be sought for in places whereby there are more availability of wood. In other words, there have been discussions by historians, for example, Venice, and there's a section in the book on Venice whereby how Venice suffered from tremendous deforestation of the immediate environment, and then as a consequence had to look elsewhere to meet their wood needs, and thus have to either import wood or had their ships being built elsewhere. And in later cases, Venice transferred its shipbuilding activities to Holland. And then on that basis provide Holland the opportunity to develop a very significant shipbuilding industry, and that this provided Holland's rise in the world economy in the 17th century. So in that context, wood plays a very important part in our human history, and I use it mostly as a proxy to understand our relationship with nature.
Also, you had some very powerful documentation in China of the process of urbanization correlated with flooding, because the deforestation and the flooding seem to be highly correlated. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. This was a long-term effort to understand, using an attempt to use quantitative data to understand the correlation between our relationship with the environment and the consequences of that. So we have been able to discover a time series of the number of floods that have occurred in China over long periods of time. And then on that basis, we try to look at that vis-a-vis the level of deforestation that has occurred, and we do have the type of relationship that we can measure. And what we have discovered is that as deforestation increases, you have flooding that occurred subsequently, and this is a very strong correlation in that context. And I don't think anybody would really question that, because even right now, in the last 5 years in China, there have been severe erosion, mainly because of extreme deforestation in the mountains along the Yangtze River. And in fact, the People's Republic of China have undertaken a series of strategies in the sense of ensuring that there was going to be not too much extreme deforestation, so that you do not have extreme flooding downstream. And so these issues might be seen now as issues of the 20th or the 21st century, but these have been recurring for the last 5,000 years. And of course, there are various opportunities whereby those various cultures have also tried to deal with this issue. And you have attempts to divert, to build dams, to terrace the land and all that, just like all the various avenues that we have also tried during our contemporary period.
How does our culture's need for oil and dependency on oil fit into the historical patterns in your book? Is this something new, or is it just part of an ongoing pattern that is being revisited?
The utilization of oil, of course, is a new source of energy and did not emerge until much later part of human history. But if we were to use energy rather than oil specifically, yes, it has been a constant feature that recurs throughout human history. And in this context, I still refer to wood as an energy source. And if you look at Roman times and Greek periods, which I discuss in much more detail in the book, to show the level of utilization of wood as an energy source, not wood as a building building material, or wood as a commodity for the manufacture of items, but wood as an energy source for heating, for cooking, and for the manufacturing process, right? And that has been a process which in that context been quite determinative of how we relate to the environment, and in this case the forest. And therefore, as you intensify the utilization of wood, you also intensify the degradation of the land. One of the things that we have to also realize is that there are tremendous costs to the environment beyond just human activities such as production or the reproduction of life. Wars cause tremendous consequences to the environment. Unfortunately, there have been less documentation of the impact of wars on the ecological environment. And in the book, I try in certain ways to suggest that this has to be factored in. And for example, the best case scenario is the Roman case, whereby the Roman army has caused tremendous ecological degradation to where it has, in that sense, extended its march. And therefore, in the book, it talks about how for 3 legions to settle down after a long march at night, they have to cut a parameter of around about 3,000 to 5,000 feet that provide them with a sense of protection from attacks from other tribal groups in areas whereby they have not fully pacified the local population. And so you pretty well can tell where the Roman army has been true by looking at pollen analysis of extreme burning of the cutting of the forest during the Roman era, and that's where the Roman army is supposed to have marched through, and beyond what deforestation as outcomes of agricultural production.
Since you wrote the book, you published one important paper that raises the question, are we entering a new dark age? And I'd like to ask you your opinion on whether a new dark age, in your opinion, is inevitable. And if so, for young people that might see that as a bleak future, are there any positive aspects of going through that period when the earth reheals?
Yes, this piece was an attempt to use what I have written in the book to try to understand the future. And one of the bases of the book was to look for pulsations in the world system, in human history, and whether there are patterns of recurrence of human history. And as I have outlined in my introductory remarks to you, that the book tries to look at transhistorical processes. And one of the things that we have to be aware of are these phases of human history where we have talked about in more detail a while ago about dark ages. Dark ages seem to pulsate human history, and to date there have been sort of recorded instances whereby both civilizations of the world experienced dark ages. Right? And from what we know about historical records, there are at least 2 major dark ages that have, in a sense, occurred in human history. One around 1750 BC to around about 500 BC, depending on the region of the world that we are talking about. And then, of course, there's the most famous one, which everybody's much more familiar with the fall of the Roman Empire around about between 300 and 400 AD until 900 AD. So that period is where most scholars are focusing on in terms of what we normally know as the Dark Age of Europe. Right? Those are dark ages. For a lot of the studies that have been done, they are looking at socio-cultural life and economic life. What I'm interested in is, of course, understanding what's happening in those realms, but really looking at what's happening with the environment. And if what's happening in the environment gives us an idea of what's going on, then can we therefore anticipate what we can face in the future? Because right now everybody's talking about the world being in an ecological crisis or an environmental crisis. And so what can we learn from those type of experiences and they fit within this type of long-term pulsating rhythms of the human and natural worlds? Well, if if you look at the Dark Ages, there are certain indicators. High levels of deforestation, deurbanization, slower population growth, in some cases depopulation. Okay? You have climatological changes. First, in the first Dark Age, starting around about 1750 onwards, you have temperature changes of between 2 to 3 degrees in the Middle East and what we now know as West Asia, okay, which has tremendous consequences on agricultural production then, and in terms of harvest and in terms of production yield. So you also at the same time have all this type of social unrest in the sense of economic dislocation does cause social movements. You have invasions from other tribal people, or what now is commonly known as barbarians, and you have migration of people from certain parts of the world, of a region to other parts of the region. If you look at those conditions, then you look at what's happening in the second period of darkness, which is from 400 to 900 AD, you also see that those type of conditions existing. So if we know that these are sort of pulsating moments that shows phases, then can we therefore talk about what we are facing right now, or what we will be facing in the future? If you look at the time phasing of these Dark Ages, they usually go between 600 to 1,000 years. And the indicators are, you have issues concerning climate changes, you have issues concerning population, and you have issues concerning urbanization. For me, urbanization is just another way of understanding the intensity of production in terms of manufacturing and the reproduction of life. Okay? So all this conditions therefore puts the environment in a state of crisis. Now, if what we are understanding and what we have been told by various groups, scientists, biologists, physical scientists, biologists, and so on and so forth, about what we are anticipating for the future, therefore, we might be at a stage whereby the planet could be going into another of one of these phases of the Dark Age. And so in this paper, I sort of hypothetically suggest that perhaps if you look at some of these indicators, they are very similar to what you can find during the Dark Age between 400 to 900 AD and between 1750 to 500 BC. And therefore, on that basis, we really have to understand history. And then on that basis, how then do we anticipate the future and how do we address the future? And that becomes the issue. On the other hand, your part two of your question concerning, are we to fear from Dark Ages? If you look at most of the writings on Dark Ages, of course, it is a worst of times for human communities because production is down, commerce is down, cultural life is in disarray, and you find indications of that. And in some cases, even in the first Dark Age, and of course in the second Dark Age, there are issues of biodiversity crisis in some regions of the world. So perhaps when we look at that, we could say, well, those are awful moments for the human community. But perhaps we should also look at it in another way. There might be wonderful moments whereby we have an opportunity to downscale, whether we choose it or not. We might be forced to downscale. And then there could be also moments of creativity when you're forced to work in a scarcity type of environment, right? Or we have a scarcity of resources. And there are opportunities that we could not just see just because it's dark. They are not interesting moments. The other thing that I really think that we should also consider is that it is also an opportunity for the natural environment to restore itself. Right? If it does not occur, then the opportunity for restoration becomes less and less. And perhaps Dark Ages as I have hypothetically argued, are also moments whereby culture gets subverted by nature, when nature, in a sense, reacts and collapses. And thus, whether we have the choice or we do not have the choice, we have to face the conditions we are in. And so, in that context, it becomes quite important for us to consider this type of possibility of occurring. Now, in other lectures that I've given, both in Europe and here in America, most often people then ask the question, what happens if we go into this type of cycle? Is there a chance of recovery? Well, if pulsations are the key, we had two major pulsations of the past, and there was recovery. A long-term recovery, but recovery. Okay. Lifestyles were more simple. In fact, fashion in Greece during the Dark Age was very simplified. And then as they come out of the Dark Age, it becomes more and more complex, more and more elaborate. Okay. Now, there are moments where we can anticipate because we have seen. Now the question is that at this point in time, whether the world is so globalized, whereby the opportunity for recovery might be less, or it might even take longer. There's also the fact that some regions of the world might not fully recover. Okay? In certain contexts, if you look at the long-term world history, there are periods and there are places whereby recovery has not fully occurred. Now, the danger is that we are at a stage whereby the whole planet is fully colonized by Earth in terms of making all the available natural resources to meet a globalized world. And of course, in this case, to meet the globalized needs of the core countries. Now, if that's the case, future recovery will be based on the fact of whether the recovery can take place on degraded land, and there are no more places left for Earth to expand. Whereas in the previous Dark Ages, there were places for them to move forth. And therefore, this enabled production to occur in other places and therefore allow those places that have been degraded to recover. But we are at a stage whereby we are fully globalized, and therefore the danger for us right now is how long the recovery will take and how much recovery will there be. Perhaps we might be leading into a very, very decentralized and very de-urbanized communities for a very long while. For some, this would be a beneficial occasion. For others who are more city-centric or urban-centric, this would be a disaster, right? So it depends on how you look at it. But what I'm sure of is that we will have the opportunity to collectively look at how we organize ourselves socially, economically, and politically, should such an occasion arise.
Well, it's been very interesting talking with you because I found your book to be one of the few books that really takes a long-term look at many of the questions you've raised. So I found it to be one of the more important books I've read recently, and thanks for talking with us.
I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you.
Thanks.